It is a beautiful day. It's 10 o'clock. It's time for 10 with Tim. My name is Tim Harris, pastor at Woodburn Baptist Church, and we are going verse by verse through the Gospel of Matthew together, you and me. Each day, Monday through Friday, Facebook, YouTube. Some of you join me live. Most of you join me some other time later, but whenever you join, I'm glad you're with me. Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 to 29. As everybody knows, the most important part of any sermon is the ending. Speaking from a pastor who preaches a lot of sermons, everything really comes down to the ending. And Jesus preaches the greatest sermon ever, the Sermon on the Mount, and the ending is important. And we're looking at the ending today. We're wrapping up the Sermon on the Mount. As I said yesterday, the teaching portion of the Sermon on the Mount technically ends with the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them to do unto you, as you find in verse 12. So what follows is literally 4 warnings, and we talked about the first one yesterday. The warnings take the form of a contrast, 2 things. Yesterday it was the wide road and the narrow road, the wide gate, the narrow gate. Today we pick up right there with the second warning or contrast. This one is about 2 different trees. You know a tree by its fruit, Jesus says, but he's speaking specifically about false teachers. It's kind of like math class back in the day where there's only one answer, but, infinity number of wrong answers. There are lots and lots of ways to get it wrong, one way to get it right. And the same is true with the gospel message, with the truth, the message that comes from the Lord. There's one gospel, there's one truth, and then there are, I guess, thousands and thousands of ways to be wrong. And so that is why it's very important for Jesus to warn his followers, warn those of us who are going to follow his teachings, that there will be false teachers. You're going to hear all kinds of garbage. You're going to hear all kinds of teachers teaching all kinds of things, and you've got to know how to learn to discern truth from lies, how to tell a false prophet from a true prophet. And Jesus just boils it down to the fruit. It's just like a tree. A tree is known by its fruit. There's no question what kind of tree it is once you can see what kind of fruit it bears. And so what Jesus, I think, is saying here is, just look at their lives. Watch their lives. Now, this isn't a matter of do they practice what they preach. Honestly, I try to practice what I preach. If I could only preach what I practice, there'd be very little for me to preach, because honestly, it's not about what I preach. I'm trying to preach what Jesus preached. What Jesus preaches, right? The truth that I'm trying to proclaim is not a truth that comes from myself or even from my life. I'm trying to teach and preach the truth that comes from Jesus. So when Jesus says you know them by their fruits, and I'm sure there he's talking about the fruit of their lives. We're not talking about do they practice what they preach. We're talking about do they practice what Jesus preaches. Do they teach and do they preach what Jesus would teach and preach? So therefore, you can know by their lives, you watch their lives, but the integrity that you're looking for is the integrity of Christ. Do they live like Jesus? Do they talk like Jesus? Do they love like Jesus? You understand? Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So he becomes the standard by which we measure everything, and certainly by which we evaluate false teachers. You with me? So next, Jesus goes on to like true disciples. If we're talking about true, the true and false preachers, now we're looking at true and false disciples. And Jesus says the day's going to come when people will stand before him and say, Lord, 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 we prophesied in your name. We cast out demons in your name. We perform miracles in your name. Lord, Lord, they expect entrance into the kingdom of heaven simply because they took his name. Because they called themselves, believers. They called themselves disciples of Jesus. They said they followed him. They said they were Christians. But Jesus makes it very, very plain here that you can't call him Lord if you don't actually surrender to his command over your life. You actually have to do what he says. It's not about do you go to church. It's not about do you read the Bible. It's not about do you listen to 10 with Tim. It's about after you read these verses in the Gospel of Matthew today, will you align your life with what they say? Because if you don't, you're wasting your time. There's all kinds of stuff on YouTube you could be watching if you're just doing this to hear words, but not to experience life change. You see, Jesus says you can't just say, Lord, Lord. You can't just call him Lord. He has to be your Lord. You actually have to do the will of the Father. Now, the common word in all of these warnings here at the end of the Sermon on the Mount is that verb for do. It's all about doing. And this is what he says here. You actually have to do the will of my Father in heaven. Next and last, the final contrast here is between two builders. Now notice, we got two men, and they have most everything in common. They are both builders. They both have an intention to build a house, and they both build a house. They also put a lot into their house, and they both experience the very same storm. You see that? But they have very different outcomes. So what makes the difference? The foundation. And this is Jesus's final story. I said that the ending of a sermon is kind of everything. And Jesus ends with a story like a lot of preachers end with a story. And this is his final story. Two builders. They're just alike in every way except one. And it has to do with what they build on, the foundation. Both builders, both build a house, both experience the very same storm, but the outcome is very different. It all comes down to what they build upon. The one who builds his house upon the rock, you see, his house endures the storm. Now, what's Jesus saying there? He's talking about what you're building with your life. You see that? And it all comes down to what you build your life upon. And understand what Jesus is trying to say. Anyone, verse 24, anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it. In other words, anyone who listens and obeys, listens and not just hears, but they actually do what I say. They're the ones who build their houses. They build their lives upon the solid rock. So do you see that? The foundation of your life, what you're trying to build, is to basically build your life, live your life out of the foundation of hearing and doing what Jesus says. This is the only thing to build your life upon. The word of Jesus, not just to hear, to know it, but to do it. You see that? You have to do what he says. You have to do what he says. Now, what's the big motivation for obedience? It's not, because you just want to be a good Christian. It's not only just that, you want to look like a Christian, you want to fit in with the church folks. No, it's the storm. This is what Jesus is teaching. The big motivation for doing what Jesus says is the fact that the storm comes. Your life is going to be tested and tried. You're going to go through some stuff. And what Jesus is saying here is if you consistently live a life where you listen and do what Jesus says, you're going to miss a whole lot of the storms of life. You're going to miss a whole lot of mess. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to miss all the storms. It's not that you're never going to go through a storm. You'll miss a lot of them, but the ones that come, you'll be able to withstand them. Now, you know what I'm saying? I don't mean, just like a one-time thing where you had a good day, obeying Jesus. I'm talking about the consistent way you live your life. Can you just imagine right now, let's just say 5 years ago, you began to listen to and practice everything Jesus would say about your finances. Can you imagine how different your financial life would be today if 5 years ago you started consistently following everything Jesus would teach about money? Can you imagine if, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when you got married, can you imagine if you had followed everything Jesus says about relationships, about love and forgiveness and patience and kindness and keeping no record of wrongs? Can you imagine if, 10 years ago, the day you got married, you just started consistently practicing everything Jesus says about relationships? Can you imagine how different your marriage would be right now? Can you imagine how different your life as a parent would be if you just followed everything Jesus says about relationships and raising kids? You know what I'm saying? Everything that Jesus teaches about everything, if you just consistently follow that, can you not imagine how much of a mess you would have already have avoided? It doesn't mean you won't still have storms in your life, but I'm telling you, following Jesus makes a difference. The storms are going to come, and that's the motivation here. This life that's lived out of knowing what Jesus says and doing what Jesus says, that's the life that's built upon a solid rock. And that's the way Jesus ends the Sermon on the Mount. That's the best sermon ever. And that's actually the best conclusion ever. Storm's going to come. But are you going to build your life upon what Jesus says? Are you going to do what Jesus says? At the end of the sermon, it says everybody's fascinated. They're amazed because they'd heard a lot of preachers and teachers. I mean, the temple's full of Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes and people who said they knew what God had said. They said they knew the law. They said that they knew how to teach it. But all of a sudden, they heard Jesus teach, and it's like he wrote the book. He has authority. Understand? It's like he's the author. He has authority. They recognize his authority, not just to teach, but to command their lives. And all of a sudden, that's different. Never heard anybody teach it like that. Not like anybody else. Isn't that amazing? Very much unlike their teachers of religious law. That's the Sermon on the Mount. Isn't that good? Tomorrow we'll pick up right there. Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 to 17. Jesus goes now from teaching. Matthew has the teaching now. We're going to see the miracles. Jesus is going to heal the man with leprosy tomorrow. And we'll pick up right there in chapter 8, verses 1 to 17. Read ahead. Have an amazing Thursday. Live for the Lord today and be thankful and praise him in all you say and do. Fill the earth with his praises today. And I'll see